Daniel, do you have any friends?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
I know. It's pretty exciting.
It's very exciting.
I know.
You actually asked one of them to be part of our podcast this year.
That's right. And it's funny because this is someone who we interviewed Wesley Hill recently, and he actually mentions Barry Danylak, who I'm about to in one of his books, and so it was kind of fun to be like, oh, I know that guy. But Barry Danylak, I first met him. Well, his parents way back in the day went to the church that I went to, and I for a while there, we call them our adopted grandparents. They've just taken us in as a family and spent a lot of time with the Danylaks. But Barry, their son at the time, he was off in Cambridge, England, studying, taking his PhD, and he would come back for vacation, Christmas. And I actually remember my mom saying, he's one of those guys that, like, you watch him listen to something, and you can just tell he's really smart. There's this look in his eye of you can tell he's processing these things deeply.
That's great.
But at one point, we went for a hike, and he called us up. This is back in high school, when I was in high school, and he said, I want to teach Daniel Greek, biblical Greek. And my mom was like, well, we can't afford that. He's like, no, I want to do it for free. I want to tutor him in it. And so for several years there, I learned biblical Greek.
Did you really learn
I
Greek?
learned, yeah, I haven't kept it up.
Wow.
But I learned a lot through him. And so Barry's become a friend, a bit of a mentor. And when he graduated from Cambridge University in 2012, I went over to watch that graduation and be part of that celebration.
And became insufferable about Cambridge
That's
ever
right.
since.
Yeah, I fell in love with it. My family background is from Cambridge too, so
Yeah,
it felt really special to be there with him. But Barry Danylak is also a scholar, so he got his PhD, as I said, from the University of Cambridge, and his focus is New Testament studies, also the knowledge of how the early Roman Empire kind of operated socially. So he's done a lot of work on sexual ethics within that time, which I think helps us understand what those ancient texts, what their relevancy might be today based on what kind of culture they were talking about at the time. He is currently the community pastor of single adult ministries at Center Street Church here in Calgary. He's done some teaching at Rocky Mountain College, also here in Calgary, and he holds graduate degrees in mathematics, Christian thought, and New Testament. He is also the author of the book Redeeming Singleness, How the Storyline of Scripture Affirms a Single Life, and he's also written another little book that you can find. It is called A Biblical Theology of Singleness. And yeah, he's been a good friend to me. I think his insights into singleness, sexuality, I've always been challenged and stimulated by them, and I'm excited to have him on the show.
Yeah, and to be completely transparent about this, we're doing this introduction before we've actually had the interview portion of it.
That's right.
So I look forward to talking to him too, and hopefully it doesn't end in a trash fire.
We'll find out.
We'll find out.
Keep listening.
I fall down to my knees. Eyes are raised to the sky.
I think we'll start then with maybe the question that might be on a lot of listeners' minds, which is why you have chosen to remain single and if you ever intend to marry.
Right. I have to be honest and say, for most of my life, I wouldn't have said I'm choosing anything. I, like most people, anticipated a relationship in my life, marriage. I was raised in a conservative Christian home, and I just assumed that the right person would come along and it would all come together. And what I noticed is that relationship after relationship, individual after individual, there was just something there that didn't feel right to me. It didn't feel like this was really something that I wanted to pursue. This was really the life partner. And over time, you begin to say, hey, there's a pattern here. And what about that? And I think I would say, as I am now plus 50 in my life, that I really have to acknowledge the contentment I have as a single person. And I would really look at it this way, that really life is about choices. And for those that choose a relationship, whether that's marriage or whether that's their living together, whatever that is, they, in some sense, they're entering into, at some level, a degree of commitment. And that commitment is really provides a degree of intimacy that you don't get otherwise. And to counter that, as a single person, really the issue is freedom, the opportunity to not have that commitment, whatever level that is, and just to say, you know what, I'm kind of king of my wallet, my time, my talents, and so there's a trade-off, and I think people need, if when people look at it that way, they say, well, yeah, you know, I want the intimacy, I'm willing to give up the freedom. And as a single person, I just say, you know, I want the freedom, I'm willing to give up that committed, intimate relationship. Now, it doesn't mean there's no intimacy in my life. It just means it follows a different sort.
I'm curious then, because I mean, Daniel and I have had this conversation about how singleness is looked at one way in the church when you're younger, and then it seems to be like, now you have to be married. And it's looked at weirdly if you get to a certain age and you're single still. So I don't know if you get that kind of pushback.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no question, Kyle. The traditional conservative Christian church has always had a presumption, a disposition toward marriage. Now, let me just say, as also a church historian, that's a particularly Protestant value belief system, largely arising very strongly with the Puritans, starts with the Reformers.
Interesting.
But I would say the Puritan understanding of the value of marriage for its own sake, the emphasis they placed on companionship as primary rather than procreation. And so that has permeated deeply the psyche of the Protestant tradition in a way that you don't find it in Roman Catholicism to the same degree. Usually there it's, oh yes, there is this estate called singleness, either in the priesthood, in monks and nuns, there is an order, there's a place for Christian community which is not married life. And so the issue typically within Catholicism is it's kind of expected people choose one or the other. And I have a group of friends who are committed Catholic celibates. They're actually Catholic and Protestant. They're ecumenical. And the Catholic brothers have a real hard time explaining this idea of being in no man's land, that they choose to be single without being in an order of the church. And so that's an interesting middle ground. But certainly you are correct. There is a strong pressure. It still is quite pervasive, I would say.
You talked about finding intimacy in other places.
Yes.
So in terms of that, where do you find that intimacy, and what relationships in your life are deepest and closest to you?
Yeah. Intimacy has different dimensions. So I think we often assume it kind of comes as a package, and that the physical intimacy is the inroad or maybe the anchor for all other aspects of intimacy. And I guess I would beg to differ with that I see a place in my life most clearly for a spiritual intimacy. Now, spiritual intimacy for me has to do with this idea of finding a deep bond of connection with those who share a bigger sense of reality with me. So for the Christian tradition, speaking from that angle, it would be this idea of being part of a spiritual family, that we are adopted into the family of God. So we appropriately would see each other as brothers and sisters, and we are family not just now, but we look forward to a sense of participating into the beyond of eternity. And that common sense of identity, purpose, and mission runs very deep. And I think that for me, that there's a certain ability to connect at a heart level, at identifying with being part of a mission bigger than myself, that is extraordinarily powerful. And I dare say, again, it's hard for me to necessarily speak for all human experience because, of course, we all have our own limited experience of intimacy. But I think often we imagine that the physical, sexual intimacy is the pinnacle of human intimacy, and I guess I would question that assumption.
Yeah, we had Wesley Hill that we interviewed earlier today, and he's talked about how there's this cult of romance in our culture that assumes that that's the only place for it. And I'm curious how that, if you can talk more about how that works out. As a Christian, I like to say myself that I find community in the church, and I find a larger family in the church. But on a practical level, especially in churches that are geared around that Puritan idea of marriage and that cult of romance that
Yes.
our whole culture celebrates, it can be very inconvenient to make that a reality. And I think back, was it the Servants of the Word you were telling us about
Yes.
just earlier? Because
Yes.
I stayed with them, with
Yes.
you, for about a week. And that was 5 years ago. It was this modern monastery, as it were, in the heart of London, where people of ecumenical, different faith backgrounds, all Christian, would stay together, worship together, have meals together, do
Live
work together.
life
Yeah.
together. It's
Yeah.
shared life together.
And it made a huge impression. Like, I haven't forgotten that years later. So I guess practically, how do you anchor yourself within that greater community, and what are practical ways that make that more of a reality?
Yes.
Right.
Well, thank you, Daniel, for being a commercial for my my personal sense of ministry and calling, which is really for the church to awaken to the reality that not everybody's married in the church and in society, and that we owe it to ourselves within the Christian church to create community, create Christian family for those that are single as well as that are married. We are not a collection of nuclear families anymore. Now that seems pretty clear to most people. We have these things called blended families. We have single parent families. We have people just in whatever relationship they find themselves coming into the church. And my belief is they all must be very welcome. We must welcome people wherever whatever their experience of intimacy, family, and sexuality is. And at the same time, we need to think about, okay, where can we take them? What do we offer them? How do we strengthen the bond of that spiritual family? How do we help them find that in their own respective life journeys? And in a way, obviously, we come from a Christian expression, so we want to offer them what we feel is the best of what we have to offer and to invite them into that. In my own experience, I'm a pastor at Centre Street Church in Calgary, Alberta, which is the largest, probably still the largest church right now in Canada, certainly from a Protestant persuasion. And part of what we aim to do at Centre Street is create Christian community for single people. And so that as a person walks into the church, there is a place for them. We have several different communities for different ages. They get to know one another. They have meals together. They have fellowship together. They pray for one another. They learn together. They socialize together. And they do mission together. They seek to serve the body of Christ, the community of Calgary, in different ways. We do special things for Christmas. We help out with various mission projects. We have outreaches, barbecues, many different ways to connect people and draw people into community. Most of those outside the church today aren't they're not coming to the church to get a good sermon. They can find that if they want. It's all over the internet, right? They don't have to come to your church for a sermon. But what they often are coming for is connection and community. They're looking for something more than Facebook or whatever social media. The best of social media still lacks something. And what is that something? And what is it that we within the church can offer them to experience that then opens the door to spiritual intimacy in a real and genuine way.
Yeah, I mean, you may have just answered this question that I've had on my mind, because one of, to take a look at root words here a little bit, to be a single person means that you are, I guess, alone with yourself, which breeds loneliness, or that, at least from the secular point of view, there's this point of view that if you are single, that you are then alone, or lonely. Do you think, I guess, how do you battle that? If you are a single person, how do you battle loneliness?
So my answer probably surprised you, but as a pastor who deals with people all day long, I hear endless challenges, complaints, issues, horror stories. I love loneliness. I look forward to it. I can't wait to have time alone where I can just be. I'm not accountable to anybody. I can just have time for myself. So I guess what I would say is loneliness is a much more complex phenomenon than being single or being married.
Right.
And I would just acknowledge that. I don't particularly find myself a lonely person. I've never really found myself to be a lonely person, largely because I am able and I seek out relationships. I seek out a degree of spiritual intimacy. I believe there's an opportunity for spiritual intimacy with every human being. That is not limited to somebody who shares your faith belief. Now, when you do share faith belief, there's certain places you can go that you're not really able in the same way to go with those that may be of a different persuasion. But there is something deep in the human experience that we all can identify and connect with each other, and we can explore that together. And I think I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that somehow marriage or relationship is going to solve all my loneliness problems.
Right.
It may help,
Right.
but I see people all the time that are single, have been lifelong singles, who are far more connected and engaged with individuals. They're sharing life experience together, and they are not lonely at all. And I dare say that I know a number of marrieds that are incredibly lonely because they were expecting something from that partner that the partner could only provide on a limited way, in a limited dimension, and they somehow have resigned themselves to not constructing their life in a way to meet that need in their life. And I believe we are empowered individuals, and the longer I go, the older I get, the more convinced I am that loneliness is a choice. It's not a imposed disposition.
Yeah, it's interesting that you're connecting that idea of almost finding identity in another person, in the sense of marriage. Like I need this person in my life in order to be fulfilled, rather than I'm fulfilled as a human being in the community that I find myself in, whether that's spiritual or with other people.
Yes.
And maybe that relationship is part of that, but you still struggle with that. So then, for someone like you mentioned the idea of being alone and loving being alone, but I don't know if that's the same thing as being lonely. Like I think we're both introverts, Colin and I, and so we need our time alone and we love our time alone. But there is an element where maybe it's because there's times where I've lived alone, house sitting, for example, and it becomes unhealthy. So are there times in your life where you realize that there's a desire for something else that you're fighting with, and that you have to change habits in order to break out of that loneliness? Or is it just something that you've built into your life at this point that is structured by community?
Well, let me say a couple things. As a single adult who is now, post 50 years of age, I have arranged my life in a variety of ways in my living situation. So, coming out of college, I lived in an apartment alone while I was at university, and I think there is probably where I really did experience loneliness.
Yeah.
Coming into a brand new city and not knowing anybody, being at a massive university. It was at University of Minnesota, and I remember having this thought in my life, or in my morning routine. I was looking at myself shaving in the mirror, and I said to myself, if I dropped dead right this very moment, would anybody know? How long would it take anybody to discover that I'm dead? And that was a very painful sort of question in my life, And how would they find me? Would it be the smell? Because eventually, it would permeate the walls of the apartment building. The university was so large, it wasn't clear how long it would take them to figure out I even wasn't there. So there was that sense.
And that happens in Japan,
point.
right? You hear stories of that actually being the
It-
case.
it-
This is not
this
a
is
pipe
probably
dream.
not just a hypothetical here. It does happen. I moved on from that to a situation where I was in a work situation, a career with AT&T. I bought a townhouse. I lived by myself alone. What I found was I had people over very frequently, and I had a coworker who started to need to share that with me. So that helped. What I've noticed is that after that, I have had very differing living arrangements as a single person. So from there, I moved to Cambridge. I was in a communal structure as part of the university, in a part of a library community. I moved from there to sharing a house with a husband and wife, an empty nester couple, and I think that was a phenomenally positive point for me because of just the shared community, the opportunity, and we weren't just, I wasn't just a tenant. We were doing life together, eating together, experiencing together. I went from there to my parents were elderly, and I had the opportunity to live with them again as a mid-40-something. From there, I have gone on to situations where I share situations with roommates and that. Now, you say, well, that's not, that's only to a point. They don't meet your deepest inner sense of being and loneliness. And again, I guess I would just say that I seek a sense of contentment in the person I am, and it could simply be the way I'm wired.
Sure.
I don't look for more than that sense of communal spiritual intimacy that I quite find so prevalently available.
Yeah.
I have. I'm curious then, because you've been in so many different situations and living situations. What do you consider to be home?
Yes. Well, I guess I'd say home is where the heart is.
Right.
But,
You're not the first to quote that.
Yeah, not the first one to say that. Yes. I actually, I was thankful you enlightened me on a few of these questions before I had the chance to answer them. And I remember looking at that one thinking, I don't know what to do with that.
It wasn't mine, it was Kyle's, so you can blame him.
I guess I would say, for me, home is the sense of personal identity of who I am, my sense of connection with the ultimate, and the connection that I have with family, which to me is spiritual family. It's the wider, broader family rather than the nuclear family. And I guess knowing my place gives me great comfort, security, and hope. And having just a sense of identity, to me, is my sense of home.
Yeah, it's funny because I would echo that as a Christian. Like, that's very similar to what I haven't said that as eloquently, and it's been 2 seasons. My work is done now. I want to tackle some of the. I want to come back to that theme at the end of our conversation, just in terms of pastoring singles. But I think it'd be helpful to kind of lay out some of the harder theology, the more that you've spent a lot of your career looking into. So let's just start. One of the questions that we spent an episode discussing, I think it was a discussion mostly, was the purpose of sex and what is the purpose of sex. And Kyle and I have similar views on it, but also quite different views in terms of practice, I think. So I wonder what for you is, if you can articulate what in your mind and in your life and then in your worldview, what is the purpose of sex? Why do we have it as humans?
Right. Well, one of the challenges is when you speak to a theologian, it's hard for them to take off that hat. To be honest, because all of a sudden my own personal persuasions and my sense of theological persuasions often interweave quite quite tightly. I would say, certainly there are 2 prominent purposes of sex. The first is the most obvious of all, which is, of course, procreation. There's the biological need we all have for reproduction of the species, and of course, that kind of goes without saying. The second, and I think equally important, but often more powerful for people, is what I would call, and I think it's been also described this way through the history of the church, is the unitive purpose. The unitive purpose being that sex is what brings a couple together deeply and intimately, and it's the powerful social and physiological glue for the relationship. One of the interesting things you find is that when you look at the words biblically, both in the Old Testament, the word for cleave, so a man shall cleave to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And that word cleave, dabak, is really there's root connections on that word with the idea of solder, and solder, the idea of fusing together pieces of metal to become one. It's that powerful and that strong. The Greek word, similarly, kalao, is connected often with glue, and it's also the same notion of cleaving is not just a sort of grabbing or attaching oneself. The idea of cleaving is the idea of being glued together, and I think that word, when we really realize what it's about, obviously is connected to the sexual union. They shall cleave and become one flesh, and that one flesh, of course, pervades all dimensions of our lives, and it creates physiological responses within us to care deeply, to love that partner, to appreciate the family and the potential for children, should they come and when they and if they come. But there is a powerful bonding dimension there. And some have said, sex is what creates the couple in that sense. It just creates a deep-seated sense of unchangeable, committed bond. And this is, of course, from a Christian perspective, why I would feel persuaded that having many sexual partners along the way in life diminishes the power of that force, of that unitive purpose. And so while oftentimes it's thought, well, it's kind of about, rules and this idea that Christianity prohibits sex outside of marriage, and it's a bit arbitrary, it feels, when in fact I think it's purposeful for the standpoint of the power of what sexual union does to build that couple and to solidify that relationship powerfully. In the case of males in particular, seeing that woman and thinking sex is in fact what happens in the physiological operant conditioning.
Woman meaning any woman, or woman meaning his wife?
No, I mean his wife.
Okay.
And so that wife can be associated with sex in a way that just powerfully drives him to care and be committed to her. However, of course, if a person has many partners, then that same functioning doesn't occur, and so it becomes oftentimes more complicated and complex to preserve that union. But I think sex has been it's a powerfully created experience that really is meant to unite that couple and preserve them in that marriage. Now, beyond that, I've often been challenged on this whole idea of, well, what about simply the pleasure aspect? Is pleasure a purpose of sex? Is it really just part of God's creation to be a pleasure for us? And I tend to resist that direction, and the reason I do is because I believe every bodily function that is necessary for our preservation as a species has a degree of pleasure, whether that's eating, sleeping, breathing. I mean, hold your breath for a while, and you will find breathing very pleasurable when you start again.
Right. Or go up on an ocean.
Yes.
Step out on the ocean bluff and breathe that in. Right?
And breathe that in, and
feels
there's
good.
pleasure. So there's pleasure. I mean, even relieving oneself. There's pleasure to every bodily function we're called to do. And quite frankly, if sex weren't pleasurable, I dare say a lot of men wouldn't get married, and we would have a problem. So there is a reality that pleasure is part of the package, but I'm reluctant to say that pleasure is the purpose any more than I would say pleasure is the purpose of sleeping or eating or any of the other, or breathing, the other things that we do as a human species.
Hi everyone, this is Kyle interrupting the conversation to let you know just a few things. As always, Assumptions is brought to you by the Alberta Podcast Network, powered by ATB. If you haven't gone to the Alberta Podcast Network's website, there are so many great shows to listen to. Shows like Repodcasting, Blue in the Face, Epic Podcast, or, and this might be weird because we're talking about singleness in this episode, The Undad. This is a blunt and goofy take on being a parent in this bizarro modernity, courtesy of Trent Wilkie, a writer, performer, and father of two. Definitely worth listening to for all the fathers out there. Check out all the great shows by going to albertapodcastnetwork.com. Secondly, we are helped by the ATB. Daniel and I both like theater, and right now the Edmonton Fringe is happening, attracting 800,000 visits to Old Strathcona over 11 days. The Edmonton Fringe Festival is one of Edmonton's biggest summer festivals, and ATB Financial is the Fringe's biggest fan. Enter the ATB Golden Ticket Contest for a chance to win 100 Fringe tickets, VIP parking, a $250 MasterCard, and more. Check out fringetheater.ca for more details. Thanks everyone for listening. In our next episode, Daniel and I will be here to decompress the entire second season of Assumptions. As of right now, that will be at least 2 episodes. If you still haven't sent in your comments or questions, you can still do so by sending it via email to assumptionspod@gmail.com. You can either do text or an audio file. A few of you have already done so, and we can't wait for you to be included in our wrap-up. But for now, let's get back to our conversation with Barry Danylak. I guess how do you balance that by saying, like, this is what the purpose of marriage is and this is why marriage is important, versus I have chosen to not do that?
Yeah. And I guess like another way of putting that question is, you've done a lot of work into singleness and how you just kind of articulate this vision for couples that is beautiful and lovely and exciting. But you haven't chosen that, and so how does that fit? How does singleness fit into that Christian vision for sexuality? Is that what you're asking?
Yep.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, first of all, I have to be careful of saying the purpose of sexuality is not the same necessarily as the purpose of marriage. I think marriage includes more than sex, obviously. And so there's other purposes of marriage. There is also purposes of singleness. One of the reality challenges that I face as a single person is the idea that sexuality, if you look in terms of the Christian understanding of sexuality, is sexuality comes with our creation. We are created male and female. In God's image, we are created male and female. So sexuality is with us, I believe, for all eternity, whether we're married or not. However, sexual union, from a Christian perspective, would be something that is intended exclusively within the marital union for the purposes I just noted, procreation and unity, to unite the couple, to strengthen the couple, and then that couple can produce children and offspring. And so the $6 million question for our singles is, how do you express fully your sexuality without sex?
Yeah.
And if you want, exactly, we're made in God's image. We're made in God's image, male and female. How do we express masculinity and femininity apart from the sexual expression of that in sexual union? And I think the answer is, out there. I don't think that somehow we're surprising God or anybody else with this question, because I think that what it means to be male, what it means to be female, is far deeper than simply the aspect of coming together in sexual intimacy. I think my maleness can be celebrated in everything from going out. We have a group of guys that loves to go out and do nothing but split logs together. And we call it, a male bonding experience, right? We're going to go just split log. We go split logs for Kingsfold Retreat Center. And we have a great time. And the more we whack at that, the more we have fun, ripping, making jokes with each other and ripping those logs. And, whether it's hunting or fishing or weightlifting, shooting guns, or there's just many things people know. I know some would say, well, you're being bigoted. I mean, women can like all these things too. Well, sure, and they may. And if they find that expresses their femininity, great. In reality, it would seem to be my observation that women often find very different things that highlight their experience of femininity, whether that is just feeling beautiful in who they are, whether it's spas, whether it's just getting together and having ladies' nights out, and whatever they may choose to do. But there's ways to express the goodness of who we are as feminine, as masculine. And granted, I know we live in a complicated world with gender fluidity and things like that. And one of the interesting things about that is it opens up people to really seek out, how do I express who I am? And from a Christian perspective, we still tend to favor the idea that there's two intended genders. But what I would acknowledge is that we have to find ways to express who we are, and our maleness and our femaleness, our expression of gender, is really something that we need to explore, celebrate, and enjoy. And the sexual union dimension is only one very, very small piece of that.
Then when it comes to that singleness as being a single within that culture, actually before we tackle that, one of the things that came up in my mind over this day of interviews is the idea of if we're made in God's image as sexual beings from day one of creation, using the Christian lingo, how does when we look at the new heaven and the new earth, which is very much a part of the Christian understanding of things, that this,
Yes.
and we've mentioned it in the idea of community, so
Yeah.
the sense of community coming together finally at the end. How does sex fit into that vision for eternity?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I was at a conference just about a year ago, and it was kind of interesting. It was on marriage and family, put out by Tyndale House, Cambridge, and I was able to present a paper there. And one of the most interesting papers was, "Will we be sexed in eternity?" And what about that? What about the expression of maleness and femaleness for all eternity, and sex? When you say sex, if you're talking about sexual union, my belief would be that this is just from a Christian theological angle, is that sex is a pointer. And the reason I say that is because the very verb that I mentioned before, cleave, kalao, is mentioned in 1 Corinthians 6 in Scripture as the idea of being cleaving to Christ. And this idea of, even as individuals, in God's plan of eternity, sex and marriage are pointers of a deeper, shall we say, a more profound intimacy that human beings are invited into with their Creator. Now, do we fully understand that? Do we fully know what that is? The answer is no. I like to say, sex is the pointer. Sex is just a taste of what is intended for us as human beings in that relationship. Now, in that sense, the culmination, the fulfillment of sex then is for all eternity, in a very real way, in a way we don't understand, we can't yet comprehend, or even imagine, to be consummated, not with other human beings, but with our Creator. Now, that is a wild idea. Now, what that means also then, from the standpoint of eternity as men and women, is that somehow we will still be men and women. I don't believe our sexuality goes away in eternity. But the ultimate expression of our sexuality is a consummation with, in some way we don't fully understand, with God Himself. The church is the bride of Christ, and so we will experience something that we have no full understanding or concept of yet now, in a profound and unfathomable way, and that the sex that goes on with human beings with each other will simply no longer be necessary, because it will be such a faint expression relative to the ultimate expression that it becomes a non-issue effectively. And so this is why Jesus will say in Luke, there is neither marrying nor giving in marriage in heaven. And the implication from a Christian perspective would be, well, Jesus makes it clear that that's because there's no longer death, there's no need for procreation, i.e., there's no longer need for sex, which serves the purpose of the procreation of the species. So when that is no longer needed, sex as we know it now is no longer needed either, which I know makes some people, feel like, how can that possibly be? But the point is, if you believe it's a pointer to something much more profound and great that we have yet to experience, then it's easier to understand that it simply won't be necessary or important to us in the way it is now.
I wonder if you can we're talking about the practical aspects of singleness, and you've been talking about the kind of the spiritual vision for not necessarily marriage, but sexuality. A lot of your work has been on the theology of singleness and creating that, and others have referred to that work. I wonder if you can just give like the 3 to 5 minute version of that, like how does your singleness fit into your worldview?
Okay, so let me just talk. I'll give you the 3-minute view of understanding of how singleness fits into the theology from a Christian perspective of what God is about. Let's maybe put it that way. And I would say that Christianity can be understood as a series of big covenants, which are basically agreements or relationships of God with his people. And the two biggest covenants, which we have, sometimes people think of the Old Testament and the New Testament. Well, of course, testamentum is just Latin for covenant, right?
Of course, yeah. We
So, in fact, you have the Old Covenant and you have the New Covenant, the Old Testament, the New Testament. In the Old Covenant, the understanding was that blessing, God was creating a physical people through, and that physical people, by the way, was the nation of Israel. It was the Jewish race, and he was doing it through procreation. And as God creates people through procreation, he then blessed them, and he blesses them by saying, if you obey these commands, blessed shall you be in the fruit of the womb, the fruit of your livestock, the production of your livestock, and of course the fruit of your crops. So procreation and marriage are central to the very notion of God's covenantal blessing. And the blessings are material and temporal. God's going to give people the promised land. They're going to prosper in the land, and they're going to live well. Now, when you fast forward to the New Testament, we have a very different story. First of all, we have a Savior and Lord who didn't marry himself. And I always point out that that's very interesting, because if we understand Jesus as the expression of the fullness of what it means to be human, and he wasn't married, and I would, counter Dan Brown and many others who argued otherwise, but that he most likely didn't have sex either, then we have a very different story. And the story really is that God invites us into a different type of relationship where God promises us that we're not going to have physical land, but we have an eternal inheritance. We have a spiritual family, and we have reconciliation in a relationship with the powerful God of the universe. Now, that is a very different sort of ideals of blessing in the New Testament, none of which require marriage or sex. They are part of a spiritual covenant relationship. And so we have eternal connection. We have a spiritual family. It's not a physical family anymore. It's brothers and sisters in Christ. And we have, of course, also that connection with God the Father himself for all eternity. And as I said earlier, I think that that's ultimately the consummation of this idea of what sex is meant to be, pointing us to. So now in that reality, interestingly enough, Scripture gives us two pictures that I point to of what this means for single people. One is the barren woman in Isaiah 53 or 54 rather, and it's a powerful picture of a woman who has no children, but she has God as her father. And what you see in that is a powerful picture of restored relationship for this single unmarried woman. And that restoration of relationship is in spiritual family, in having spiritual children, in birthing people into the family of God and into the kingdom of God. You have a similar picture just a couple chapters later, 2 chapters later in Isaiah 56, of a male figure, of this eunuch individual who again has no children, and the implication is a sexless being in some way. And here he is, from a male perspective, he is promised a name and a place better than sons and daughters. His identity is restored. His legacy is restored. Legacy that he doesn't have because he doesn't have family and children to remember his name. God will give him a more powerful name and a powerful place. Well, you have these figures, and clearly I think this is what the New Testament is speaking to this idea of the value and purpose of singleness. And in reality, I like to say the church age is split into 3 periods. It is split into the age of the Old Testament, where everybody married and had children, and blessing was strictly within the locus of that family marital expression. We have the age to come where nobody marries. And in fact, the consummation experience is with God, between God and his people. And then you have what we call the church age, the after Christ, where the church is intended to be a wonderful blend of those who are both married and those who are single. And Jesus, we might remember, invites anybody and everybody who is able to grasp this idea of being single for the kingdom to do so. And he challenges us to receive that teaching in Matthew 19. And it's an invitation to say, boy, brother or sister, if you can stay single, you should. And so there is a dramatic turn of events in that way, still recognizing, of course, that the majority of individuals will choose the path of marriage. And that is, it's not in any way denigrating marriage. It's just simply what I would say is it presents a high view of singleness and marriage within the family of God in the body of Christ. And that is the middle age period, which we would call the church age.
So then, kind of building off of that, then, I mean, there's definitely been lots of discussions about like LGBTQ people within the church and outside of the church. I'm curious how you view like singleness in that framework. I think sexuality seems to be super important in the secular age that we live in here right now. How do we interact with the singles of the LGBTQ community who want to be part of the church?
Well, first of all, I believe the church is open to all persons, and we all we all are individuals with a sense of heart, of soul, of purpose, and of being. I believe we are all invited into the family of God, and so in that sense, I think we do need to be colorblind and sexual orientation blind and everything else, that there is clearly an inclusive picture within the New Testament vision of what the church is meant to be. What I would say, as far as the various sexual expressions of different orientations in that, and again, I'm speaking from an individual who myself I'm a celibate male, and for my life, so it's not been obviously something that has been important in my life to the point where I couldn't live without it. I have lived without it, and I would simply say that the New Testament opens a window to a life of singleness, acknowledging that every single one of us have proclivities, desires that in one way or another probably won't be expressed as our desires might desire them to be expressed. In other words, what makes us human beings, in a sense, and I would believe even the Romans understood this, is not the open expression all the time of our sexual urges, but actually the control of those for the higher purposes to what we believe we are called to within the purposes to which are our greatest and most deepest life commitments. So, I would invite everybody in. At the same time, we have, even apart from the LGBTQ community, the church constantly struggles with heterosexuals who struggle with this idea of sexuality. And when, I say to single people, the God's best for you is to exercise restraint on those sexual urges. It's hard. And it's hard for everybody whether they're dealing with same-sex attraction, bisexual, heterosexual. We are all in some sense experiencing a degree of that struggle, and I would simply say that there is grace in sharing in that struggle and acknowledging that struggle, and simply surrendering to the struggle doesn't necessarily make us stronger, deeper, greater human beings. It often is the case that we are strengthened in developing, what the Romans would say is temperance, right? This idea of exercising that self-control over our tendencies, and there's strength. And I would say from my personal experience that in exercising restraint, there has been the greater strengthening of my body and soul to continue down that path, and I guess that's the way I would see it. I don't as far as the homosexual expression, I will simply say this: I don't see that as naturally part of God's design as I read Scripture. Now that's just my conclusion. At the same time, it certainly isn't any more of a sin in God's eyes than anything else that we get involved with that in that category. And I think the church would do well to focus far more on its own house cleaning in terms of sexual conduct than certainly maligning any or targeting any outside community. Because I think that's really that is hypocritical when we do that. So we need to acknowledge that we need to come alongside each and every individual with their own struggles of sexuality and help them see a vision of what God has created for sexuality, and say, there is good both to exercise of sexuality, the sexual experience within the context God has designed for it. There's also a strong good in the exercise as most of us, in fact all of us have to do to some extent, in the restraint and strengthening our heart, mind, and soul in actually sometimes saying no to desires in our life. And of course we have all sorts of desires that plague our soul. That's the reality that we live in. And I always tell my singles, I say, there's not much difference between a married person and a single person, because, a married person or a single person may have 8 billion, individuals off limits, sexually, but a married person has 8 billion minus 1. And so we're not too different. We live in a world where we have to learn to control the desires that are natural. I'm not saying they're not natural. I think lots of desires are it's part of the human experience, but nevertheless we have to come to terms with them and bring them to a place where they are expressed appropriately within our human experience.
Any last questions?
Yeah, it's not often you have a Cambridge scholar in the house, or on your mic for that matter. And you've spent a lot of your professional life researching the conditions of culture and specifically sexual culture within the context of the New Testament being written, so the Roman context there. Because it's something that's come up, Kyle, in our discussion of, or I've heard it, I'll put it another way, I've heard a professor of mine just in conversation say, well, I've heard that that back in the time homosexuality was more of a child thing, like it was men with children, or it wasn't this loving relationship that it is now. So then that should change. I just wonder if you can shed some light on what the how that affects your understanding of biblical sexuality, your scholarship in that area.
Well, let me talk a little bit about the Roman situation. As I understand it, of course, there's many scholars out there, and I am one, but I'm sure there's others that may be even more of an expert specifically on sexuality. Yes, there certainly was it was certainly more common for older men in the homosexual experience to be with older men with younger men. However, I don't believe that was exclusive. I think there were many expressions of sexuality within the Roman world. There was a very different. My understanding would be what was morally repulsive for sexuality for men was not whether they had sex with men or women, or with that they would have equal access, for example, with slaves, to have sex with men or women.
Temple
What
prostitutes.
what was morally repulsive generally for Greeks and Romans was, shall we say, playing the female, and in doing and that was considered effeminate. So one would say, it was one aspect of homosexual sex and not the other. So there's certainly plenty of references there. The other difference that I would note is that I think in the Greco-Roman world, they would not normally, the idea of homosexual marriage would be quite foreign to them. And the reason being is that the main purpose for marriage was to produce an heir, and that you would have somebody to take care of you, to manage your estate, to be there for you in old age. Marriage wasn't. Now there's controversy here, because some would say, well, there's the Stoics and there was a certain ideal of marriage as companionship. The problem I have with that is I think they're reading only one or two authors and who weren't necessarily mainstream. And so the question is, what was the mainstream thinking? And I think the mainstream thinking largely was varied, but oftentimes the males didn't necessarily look to their wives so much as a intimate companion for their loneliness in that, as much as a practical economic companion to manage the household, to produce the children. And men often had their sexual experiences with other women, whether they're concubines or courtesans or prostitutes or whatever, depending on class and status. And so, or young men or slaves or wherever. So their sexual experiences are often much broader and much wider than the marital union. And this is, of course, probably the reason when Paul in 1 Corinthians 7, surprisingly for many people, commands husbands and wives to have sex. He says, do not deprive one another in 1 Corinthians 7:5. Well, why does he need to do that? Well, because oftentimes the men were finding other sexual outlets other than their wives. So as far as homosexuality, my reading would be that the idea of homosexual marriage would be quite exceptional. I think of Suetonius, who, of course, the one of the famous homosexual marriages was Nero, and that was done partly as a parody. When Nero was extravagant, and Suetonius writes that there was a rumor going around at Rome at that time that only if Nero's father had had such a wife as Nero, that Rome would be a better place. In other words, if his father had only a gay partner, then Nero wouldn't have existed, and etc. So there was a humor in there, certainly in his writing, just because they would have certainly welcomed gay relationships, but they wouldn't have seen it needful to identify it with marriage, which was really a political act to identify your son as your own. Really was the main purpose. Was there more to your question? Did you want?
It's fascinating. I guess just like I think what I was trying to understand a little bit, which I think you've unpacked a little bit, was just how, I mean, Paul in his letters and the rest of the New Testament authors talk a lot about sexuality and sexual culture around them. And I think it's helpful to realize how much of that was prevalent at the
Understanding
time.
the context
Yeah.
of why those letters were written in the first place.
And
I
how
think
they
we should
compare
start
to ours.
a history podcast.
That's
Well,
right. Yeah.
there's
Cambridge history.
Yeah, there's one other thing I could add to that, and that is what is going on, and I think people really don't understand this very well. When Jesus is in Galilee, the general disposition of Jews toward sex was based on Genesis, that sex did belong in marriage, and that wasn't so the understanding of Christianity and Judaism were actually quite similar in terms of sexual morality and codes of sexual morality. However, when Paul takes the gospel to the Corinthians, to the Greeks, he is running into a completely different culture. And their culture would have been much more similar to our post-Christian secular culture today in modern society, which would be sex is, one's sexual expression is completely different than one's decision to marry. And so when Paul in 1 Corinthians 7 is interacting with the Corinthians, it seems to me quite clear that the whole issue there was he's trying to suggest to them that the decision of marriage is directly tied to the decision of your sexual conduct, and that they go together, and that God's intention is that prostitutes weren't sort of the go-to for your sexual outlets or slaves or whoever, but that God's intent was the marriage was to be the locus of one's sexual expression and activity. Now, he's really challenging them strongly, because in their world, they would see no connection between the two. Now, I think that's often the case today. Most people would say, well, I have my sex life, and then later I may or may not decide to get married. And the marriage is a matter of a civil commitment decision I'm making that is not necessarily tied to my sexual choices that I have, that I live. And so that's a pretty modern understanding. But again, in the classical Christian sense, the expectation was that sex would wait until marriage.
Well, thanks for articulating all that. I think it's been really helpful. And I think one of the things that I appreciate from this conversation is how you've been able to place these, I guess, more traditional sexual ethics within the grander vision, which is, it's for me at least, a beautiful vision of the Christian worldview, but also how you're separating biblical sexual ethics from Christian cultural sexual ethics and church cultural sexual ethics, which I also can't say, apparently. But just, I think separating those is really helpful, because often what we're used to in terms of the moral system of the West is actually very different from what the biblical vision is. And untangling those is really helpful, and I think you've done a helpful job with that.
And I'm always very interested in context and history and like how things fit into each other. I think it's easy enough to say we live in a vacuum right now, but there's things leading up to why people believe the things they do here and fight against that sort of thing. So yeah, this has been great.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me.
Assumptions is produced by Kyle Marshall and Daniel Melville Jones. This episode edited by Kyle Marshall. Our thumbnail was created by the always great Chris Taniguchi. Most of the music in this episode is from the band The Parson Redheads. You can check out their music anywhere digital music is available. If you want a full rundown of the articles and media that we reference, check out the show notes that Daniel puts together that are attached to this episode. It's always just a fantastic document that he puts together. Thanks for listening to The Credits. We'll be back again in a couple of weeks.